once for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
Phew, this episode has been somewhat of a mission to produce. We've certainly had an eventful start to the year. Unfortunately, we suffered a loss in the family due to that which will not be named, and other family members were affected to a lesser degree, including some needing hospital care. I had my own minor, but still stressful health issue, and we had some drama with the cat who developed diabetes, but I'm pleased to say has now gone into remission following a tense few weeks of testing and adjusting insulin levels. We're still on full lockdown over in the UK, which has curtailed our visits somewhat, and I think we're suffering more than a little from cabin fever. Judging from the news though, it seems like there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we're both looking forward to a hopefully more positive 2021.
Thank you so much for being incredibly patient waiting for this episode, and to those of you who've sent us messages of support. It really has meant the world to us. You are all the most amazing listeners we could ever hope for. We sincerely hope that you are all well, had a wonderful Christmas and New Year, and that you're ready to free yourself from your worries for a little while and indulge in some ghost stories with us. So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up, we have a haunted Christmas present on the Paranormal radar, listener stories from Melissa, Marianne and Juliet, and we look into one of our favourite paranormal mysteries, Timeslips.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a big thank you to our latest patrons.
Nikki Marburger,
Felice Millar,
Mindy Bloom,
and to Sierra Cersei for upping her pledge.
We'd also like to say thank you to Alice, Harriet and Kelly for making donations through Ko-fi.
As always, we want to say a huge and heartfelt thank you to all of our patrons, old and new. Not only do you keep the show going, but in difficult times like these, you keep our spirits up. Genuinely, thank you.
It's time now for our Paranormal Radar story, and this one comes all the way from Brandon, Missouri, where it appears the spirit of Christmas is still in residence. It began shortly after Christmas when the Merritt family began hearing knocking on the walls of their home, which were on occasion loud enough for them to believe someone was knocking on their front door. On checking, however, there was no one to be seen. This would happen late into the night and prompted Mrs. Merritt to call her husband, who was working nights, at midnight for reassurance as she checked the door to once again find it empty. The banging on the walls became louder and more insistent, and also started to happen in the attic. The Merritts attempted to ignore it at first, but it became so intense that Mr. Merritt charged into the attic one night with a torch and a shotgun, suspecting that someone had broken into their house. He was, like his wife, to find no source for the noise. From banging, the activity ramped up to breaking things in the house, and it seemed whatever it was, wasn't particularly fond of mugs. Several times the family were to hear a smashing sound and find multiple mugs smashed, and once, whilst clearing up the mess left by a smashed mug, there was a loud sound from the kitchen as if someone was pouring cutlery into the sink. But again, on investigating the noise, they found the sink empty, and there was no apparent source of the sound. The activity then began to spread further, with their children's toys being moved or disturbed, including the classic horror story trope that would send a shiver down anyone's spine. Battery-operated toys suddenly began playing music and operating by themselves. Doors began slamming, and they even began seeing Vardogas. Not that they called them such in the article, but Mrs. Merritt saw her husband pass her and enter the kitchen, only to find he wasn't home, and Mr. Merritt heard their son come home and close his bedroom door whilst he was still at school. Somehow, Mr. Merritt seemed to intuit that the activity was being caused by a vintage doll's carriage that had been gifted to their daughter for Christmas by Mrs. Merritt's mother. On removing the carriage from the house, the activity suddenly ceased, and the family currently have it listed on Facebook Marketplace with the hope of someone taking it off their hands. For $65. Nothing in life comes for free, I guess. Though they have apparently at least disclosed that the item is haunted in their listing.
Okay, so I can understand why you would list an item for auction like that, because if you were just to take it to the tip and dump it, somebody might pick it up unwittingly, not knowing that it was haunted.
Mm-hmm.
Same if you took it to a charity shop or anything like that. I suppose the act of listing it like this allows you to prepare people and say, look, this is haunted, full disclosure, just so you know what you're going to get. But why would you put it up for $65 if you wanted to be rid of it?
Yeah, I think, I waver back and forth on this, because the first thought was, they're just trying to cash in on like the eBay Dybbuk boxes and haunted dolls and things and, make as much money as they can. But they put it on Facebook Marketplace, which I think is just a fixed amount. You can't sort of bid against each other to get a maximum amount.
Yeah.
And Facebook Marketplace, the range is normally quite limited, isn't it? So, I don't see things from America, whereas I might do on eBay.
Yeah, you can set the locality, but it's pretty local.
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking if they just wanted to maximize profit and have a spooky ghost story, then it'd be eBay rather than...
Well, I suppose the thing is that a doll's carriage isn't easy to post.
No.
If somebody on the other side of the Atlantic bought it, then that's going to be a nightmare to send. It's a big thing. So I guess that makes it, if it's listed on Marketplace, you're going to be able to put collection only.
Mm-hmm. Although I love the fact that we're just talking about the logistics of it rather than anything else about the story. Just like, that'll be awkward to post.
What else is there to say? Dolls are creepy. Everything to do with dolls are creepy. And apparently so are dolls' carriages. I was right all along. The end.
Enough said.
Exactly. Well, before we start with the stories, we've got a couple of listener comments to share with you today.
The first is from Mary, and she got in touch regarding one of our recent episodes where we shared somebody's story whose cutlery was going missing. Was it teaspoons or forks?
Teaspoons, I think.
Teaspoons, because we have forks going missing, which is why I probably confused that one. But she says, I've always been a bit sensitive. I've got a fair few stories of my own, and I'm also a witch, so my relationship with the other side is a bit different. But as it relates to this person's encounter and your own, I've also had things go missing. It's never been anything major or overly sentimental, but occasionally I'll need to find something and it's just gone missing. To be fair, I'm not terribly systematic like a police officer would be, but each time I search the entire house and coming up empty-handed, I'll stand in the centre of our house and request the items be returned. Sometimes I'm able to find the item right after. Sometimes it will be there when I come home from work later in the day, and there have been a few instances when I'm making that petition to the resident ghosts that my cat will come into the room. Out of curiosity, I decide to follow him, and we often end up in the room that I'll later find the item. This could be completely unrelated, but it seemed worth mentioning. I wish I knew if there was a pattern to the disappearing items, or why some spirits seem to have the magpie instinct. Oh well, it'd also be interesting to see if possibly the teaspoons and watches and things that were moved stopped going missing for a time. Perhaps the ghost thinks that they're just going about their day, getting ready, putting on a watch, making tea. Perhaps the original submitter of the story has managed to put items exactly where an earlier resident had put theirs before. As the teaspoon thefts have been happening for much longer, that could void that theory, but it's a theory nonetheless.
Oh, I love that idea that you've accidentally just sort of put your everyday sort of normal items exactly where they used to sit for the previous resident, and they've just got confused and picked them up because you'd think it was yours. And
maybe, as we're about to get into, it could be a time slip. And they're just like, what's this teaspoon doing out here? Put it away or don't have it. And it's ended up 40 years in the past or 20 years in the future or whatever's going on.
It could be. Well, at one of my childhood homes, that was one of the things that we used to hear when we were upstairs. It happened when myself and my brother were home alone. a couple of times, and my parents had gone out and it was just the two of us. We were upstairs and we'd hear somebody downstairs making tea. I mean, the sounds of a person making tea are very distinctive, you know, the clatter of the spoon in the china, and it just sounded like somebody just pottering around making a cup of tea, and it was just really nice.
So yeah, if anybody is having this same sort of thing, then do let us know if just saying, excuse me, can I have my things back, please, actually works.
It did for my mum. I can't remember whether we talked about this in the last episode when this story came up, so I'm really sorry if it did. But yeah, my mum was going absolutely mad looking for something, and she turned the house upside down for about 3 days straight. And it just happened that I spoke to her on about the third day when she was just tearing her hair out over it. And I said, why don't you just, go stand in the middle of the house and say, please, can I have my thing back? And she was like, right, okay, fine, I'll try it. And she did. And it immediately she found it. It didn't just turn up. She just had a sudden thought pop into her head. Oh, I wonder if it's in. And it was somewhere you would never have thought to look. And she couldn't remember why on earth she would have put it there. But that's where it was. And it was almost immediate.
Awesome.
We also had a listener comment from Janelle about our Christmas episode. She said that she loved our Christmas episode and looks forward to that all year long. Thank you, Janelle. We actually look forward to making that episode all year long. It is so much fun. But she says, I was a little taken aback when you read the 2 cheesy Christmas jokes at the end of the show. The day before I listened to the episode, my husband had asked Alexa to tell us some Christmas jokes, and they were 2 of the dumbest jokes I've ever heard. Turns out they were the same 2 jokes you read in the same order. Probably just a case of there being very few Christmas jokes out there, but it was a little strange to hear. Wow, do you know, there are loads of Christmas jokes.
I don't think I'd heard those 2 before.
No.
Bearing in mind that over here we have crackers every year, and you get the occasional ones that come up time and again.
There are a few classics that everybody knows, but these weren't those. I think these were actually new ones. I didn't recognise them at all. So that is really weird.
Yeah, what are the chances of getting the same jokes in the same order?
I know, that's mad.
Crazy.
Yeah. Thank you for letting us know that. That's really interesting.
Maybe Alexa listens to the show and is pinching our material. Do you reckon we can sue Amazon for plagiarism?
No, let's not go there.
No, let's not even mention that.
Let's not even mention that. Rewind. Yeah, let's leave the big corporations alone, shall we? And get on with what we do best, sharing some ghost stories. So if you're all sitting comfortably, Fitz will begin with this story from Melissa.
Just over 10 years ago, I moved with my 6-year-old daughter and quite large lab pitbull mixed dog to a small town in North Dakota to live with my then fiancé. The house he owned was quite small, perfect for a bachelor, but inadequate for a family. We made do as best we could, as we had the house on the market, but being such a small town, it took 2 years to sell. The house had never felt particularly ominous to me. Having been dating 2 years before becoming engaged, I'd spent plenty of time there, although never alone. The trouble started after my second daughter was born. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, but it had originally been one big room, which was divided by a wall, meaning that you had to walk through the smaller room, which was my older daughter's, to get to the larger room in the back, shared by my now husband, myself and our baby daughter. My husband had started a new job working for the city, which required him to sometimes work quite late, clearing roads during snowstorms and such. I first noticed that our rather lazy and gentle dog, who would sleep every night in my older daughter's bed, would sit at the top of the stairs staring down with the hair on his back standing up. This only happened on nights when my husband was out. I wrote this off as him being more protective of us when the alpha, my husband, was out. Our second daughter had quite a lot of trouble sleeping through the night due to colic, and I would often end up waking 2 or 3 times a night and take her downstairs to avoid waking my husband and other daughter. The stairs came down into the dining room, and a few feet to the right of the steps the room opened to the family room. I would bring our baby through the dining room to the rocker in the family room, always keeping the lights off to avoid waking her more. This kept up for nearly 15 months, and several times I was so sleep deprived I would nod off while rocking her and sleep the rest of the night there in the family room. It was then I started feeling a presence in the dining room. At times I would startle awake while holding the baby in the rocker, sure someone had just said my name, to realise everyone was still asleep. I felt a heavy, foreboding feeling some nights carrying the baby down the stairs, but I didn't feel I had a choice but to pass through the dining room to get to the family room. One night I was rocking the baby, having just brought her downstairs, when I thought I saw my husband peek his head around the wall in the dining room. It was really a fleeting glance of a dark shadow, but I assumed it was him, too tired to really pay any attention. The next day I asked what had woken him, as he could always sleep through the wails of our baby, and it was unusual to see him up at all in the night. He said he didn't know what I was talking about and that he wasn't up. I again wrote it off to my sleep-deprived brain. Eventually I became so sleep-deprived, I reluctantly moved her crib to the dining room, which was the only available space, and she immediately started sleeping through the night. Except for the dog's strange behaviour, I didn't have any other experiences besides the occasional bad feeling walking down to the bathroom in the night. After 2 years living there, we sold the house to a single man and moved to a larger 4-bedroom house across town. The atmosphere of the new house was totally different, lighter, airier somehow. I never felt the foreboding feeling while up at night, and the dog slept in my daughter's bed every night, even when my husband was out. Somewhere around 5 or so months after we moved out, the man who bought the house stopped me in the grocery store and asked me if anything weird had ever happened to us in the house. I stared open-mouthed at him. I told him aside from some off feelings, nothing had ever happened. He said there were incredibly strange occurrences for him there. They had changed the dining room to a family room, and the family room became a bedroom for his brother who'd moved in with him. He told me the TV in the family room would switch off and on during the night. Doors would slam, and he would come home to objects having been pushed off his dresser. I was shocked. Nothing like that had happened to us. That weekend, I went to a golfing event at the local country club. I was golfing with some slightly older women, who I'm not particularly close with, but am on friendly terms. They asked me about our new house, and for some reason I felt compelled to tell them how the new owner of the house had approached me with the strange occurrences. They proceeded to tell me that several years before my husband bought the house, a young family lived there, and the father had died of cancer. He had been brought home on hospice, and his bed was set up in the dining room by the window, where he died. He had a young daughter who he absolutely adored. I now wonder if he was hanging around checking on us because of our young daughters, and maybe I just interpreted the feeling of having him there as a bad feeling or sadness. It did occur to me that my daughter's crib was set up in just the spot he would have died. I wonder if he saw me struggling with her not sleeping and was trying to help somehow. It's now been several years, and despite still living in the same small town, I find that I avoid going past our old house.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Melissa. And I completely agree. I think it's really easy to mistake a really tangible atmosphere of a place for being possibly negative or oppressive. A lot of times when you go into a property and there's a definite sort of energy there, and it sounds like it might have just been an energy left behind by this man, by this family. And when you're living with it all the time, it can feel a bit oppressive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or negative or it means to do you harm. And it certainly doesn't sound like that was the case here.
I think a lot of the time you're just kind of picking up on the feeling that something out of the ordinary is happening, and your natural instinct is to be afraid or cautious of it. I don't think it's necessarily, this is definitely bad. It's just weirdness, and your body kind of reacts to it.
Yeah, of course, and that is a completely normal reaction. The only thing is, though, that it sounds like the tenant after them had a bit worse of a time of it. And I wonder whether that was just a case of ghosts don't seem to like change.
Yeah.
They're like me. They get used to a family and you kind of manage to live harmoniously. And then, activity normally starts to pick up either when somebody else moves in or when there's renovations, they do work on the house, they sort of move furniture or rip out walls. And I think ghosts just don't like change. And I can completely understand that. I'm the same. I don't like change.
No, we had a discussion about this recently because I'm going bald and I'm talking about just shaving my hair off and being done with it. And Lil's like, no, I can't. I don't want you to.
I don't like change. It scares me. It upsets me.
So thank you again, Melissa, for sharing your story. And it's time for our next listener story of the episode. And this one is from Juliet.
In 1983, I was a graphic designer in Los Angeles. I worked on creating graphics on artboards, designing labels, court exhibits, and point-of-purchase displays. I also had a crazy idea to create a time management notebook system before laptops and cell phones blew up the simple paper and pen. These activities meant I would drive into Hollywood to Hillside Graphics on Sunset Boulevard to pick up my type order. That meant I picked up Word graphics printed out on photographic paper in the font and size I ordered. When I took it to my studio space, I back-coated it in wax and applied the words to the artboard using an X-Acto blade. I was pretty good at this, and totally self-taught, but I did spend some time reordering type with size adjustments and font changes, which meant that on a given project, I could spend a lot of time going back and forth to Hillside Graphics. I would park on Wilcox Street just off Sunset to avoid paying for parking and walk to Hillside's office. There were homes on the street, the old Hollywood bungalows that cost a fortune today. They're quasi-craftsman style with brick and stone chimneys, bay windows, oak floors, built-in dining room cabinets, and ceramic bathrooms of white and black octagonal tiles. A more solid wood structure with lath and plaster would be hard to find. There would be no plastic and no Tyvek, and their square footage would be reasonable with no ostentation, and would include a yard with neighbours close but not on top of each other. These homes were once the residences of working people of Hollywood, when the entertainment industry was the employer. But in the 80s, these homes were in disarray. They were shabby and in need of paint, and the neighbourhood had fallen on hard times. There was an uptick of violent crime and a number of abandoned homes in these Hollywood streets. One of those homes was right at the back of Hillside Graphics. It was white and in need of some repair. The yard was overgrown, and there was a brick back step that led into the house, with straggly ivy growing up the side of the back door. The main window had an eyelet curtain that had a tear, and some mornings I saw it flutter as though someone had just let go of the curtain. By that window there was a black gash on the paint, where a flame had quickly licked the window casement but failed to ignite the outside lintel. There had been a fire, but it had been stopped before real damage took the house. I had seen homeless people leave the house early one morning, dishevelled, carrying bags, leaving from that side of the house. I say side because the house sat between two streets, Wilcox Avenue and North Hudson. The back of the house was facing Wilcox, and the window was the back bedroom window where the fire had been. It was an uncomfortable building to me. As I came and went to the typesetters, I found myself avoiding the house, parking further down the street, even though there was a parking space in front of the house. My discomfort when near the house gravitated from sadness to thoughts of violence. After a while, I came up with the notion that something violent had happened there. Why else would I be so uncomfortable with this empty house? One morning, I arrived early to see the local fire station actively dousing the grounds and building with a milky substance, which turned out to be fire retardant. Squatters had again started a fire to cook a meal in the house and had set a few other things on fire too. That's when the boards went up on the doors and windows and no trespassing signs were added. The fire department was trying to discourage late-night visitor sleepovers, but they were only partially successful, and a few people continued to use the house. Today, I wonder if squatters would have continued to do that if they'd known what had happened there, but at that time, I was ignorant of that story. Several months went by. I was at a slow point for type and design and didn't go to Sunset Boulevard. I'd been house hunting and we'd found a house to buy in Pasadena. However, a court job presented itself for an exhibit, so I was again going back to Hillside Graphics. It was a Monday. I parked down the street, only this time it was because there were again firemen on the property. I thought that this time I could ask about the house. They were again using fire retardant and posting more signs. I walked up to the captain and asked him about the property. I learned that the house was slated for destruction, but that it would be at least a year since the city was very behind in demolitions, and the heirs of the property were not capable of taking care of the house. Then he mentioned that this house had been the scene of a violent murder of the elderly female owner. The captain stated that it was surmised that the owner of the house allowed a homeless man into her home, who killed her and set fire to her in the back bedroom, the room where the curtain was torn. There had been several similar murders, and the LAPD thought that there was a serial killer in Hollywood, murdering elderly women living alone in the neighborhood. It had been a violent assault, and the killer had set fire to the house to destroy evidence. The victim was a woman of 70+ years, someone known to help people down on their luck. I also learned that the victim had been a bit of a player in Hollywood and was somehow related to an old star, maybe an ex-first wife or girlfriend, but after the divorce or separation, she remained in the same house for over 50 years. She grew old there as Hollywood changed and the neighborhood became more transient. A bit like Gloria Swanson with no money but many memories, residing just off Sunset Boulevard and eventually attracting a man that would enter the property. But her close-up came care of the LA Police Department, Hollywood division that was just down the street. On a Wednesday morning, I awoke and immediately recounted to my partner about a dream I had had. The woman in the house was speaking to me. She was dressed up in some 1940s outfit with padded shoulders and snappy heels, sitting on an overstuffed hunter green couch from the 1940s, with huge, fat, curved, upholstered arms. She was admonishing me with her arm raised to find out about me, to look her up in the library quick because they're destroying all the evidence. And then, as a last comment before I was completely awake, the dream figure said, "Eddie did it," and "Go to the authorities and tell them." I was convinced that this was more than a dream. I've never been visited by a victim of homicide, let alone given instructions. I went to my alma mater college library and I read the news articles that sanitized the murder. The local librarian that helped me was from Haiti, and I explained why I was looking. She was intrigued and told me that these things happen in her country, and yes, you should go to the authorities. But I still didn't understand or have even a remote clue as to why I was told they are destroying all the evidence. On Friday, I had to return to get my type, and so I drove down to Sunset. I didn't turn to the side street of Wilcox. I parked on the boulevard. I was filled with trepidation and curiosity. Should I look at the house? No, forget it. But I couldn't do it. I went to the front of the house on North Hudson, and there was no house. What remained of the house after being bulldozed were 3 neat piles of broken beams, roofing paper, floorboards, plaster, glass, river rock, and tiles. The house was gone. At the top of the nearest debris pile protruding from the side was the overstuffed arm and seat of a hunter green 1940s couch. I ran to my typesetter's office. When was that house torn down? Early Wednesday morning. Yes, they truly had been destroying all the evidence.
Thank you, Juliet, for sharing that story. That was a really interesting one.
I know. All the hairs on my arms went up, especially the bit about the couch.
Yep, I was going to say exactly the same thing. It was the couch that did it.
I was watching your face for that moment when I read those words, and it was brilliant. Because how? What an amazing experience. But yeah, I can understand that you might have been subconsciously thinking about the house because you passed it so often. But that kind of detail with the hunter green 1940s couch, you can't just have plucked that out of nowhere.
No, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, obviously there's certain styles and things, but to be that particular...
It's very specific.
Mm-hmm.
And to have had the dream the same morning that house was torn down is just amazing. I mean, you're so lucky that you actually saw it, that you happened to go to the typesetters that day and saw the remains, because you would never have had that corroboration. If it had been a couple of days later, all that stuff and the couch might have been removed and people would have forgotten what day it was. And you would just never have known.
I want to know if Eddie did it.
Well, yes. I think we all want to know if Eddie did it. Who's Eddie? What a mystery.
So if you ever do find out more about what happened or whether Eddie did it, then do let us know.
Yes, please do. Well, it's time for our last listener story of the episode, so get ready for this one from Marianne.
A while back you were asking for men's stories, so I thought I'd share a little story from my husband. Now, he's not a skeptic exactly, he's just one of those scientific types who knows that ghosts and such are not real. But there was the time that the ex-husband of a woman he was dating, before we were married, was killed when he was struck by a car whilst out on a bike ride. So, to help the family, my husband obtained an old bicycle, painted it white, put flowers on it, and placed it by the side of the road at the site of the accident. That's what we do in Idaho to commemorate bicyclists who were struck by cars. A couple of days later, he was walking his dogs in the foothills above the city. The man appeared to him and thanked him for what he'd done to help his family. Then he disappeared. I was aware of this story because Bob, my husband, called me up to tell me about it. So fast forward a few years, and now we're married and my daughter brings up the subject of ghosts. My husband states unequivocally that there is no such thing. So I ask about this guy, and he admits that yes, he did see him, but he couldn't have been a ghost because they don't exist, and no, he doesn't know what it was. If I'm lucky enough to die before my husband, I'm going to be the most annoying not a ghost he's ever encountered. And since that which shall not be named is still at large and we're all still sitting around in our respective houses, I thought it would be fun to share one of my daughter's stories. She's 31 and works for my husband and lives with us. Sometimes my husband and I will drive about 8 hours to visit his family. Then my daughter takes care of our 2 dogs and 3 cats. When we moved into our current house, which was built in 1946, My daughter and I agreed that if it wasn't haunted, it should be. But there was no evidence of paranormal activity until we left Alex alone in the house with all the animals. One evening, she walked out of her bedroom to discover that a living room lamp had been turned on. Now, this lamp has a switch up high and has to be rotated about 360 degrees to turn on, so the animals couldn't have bumped it. But a light turning on is pretty easy to ignore because, electricity. Who knows what electricity can get up to when no one's paying attention? But then it escalated. The last time we went out of town, I got a late night text from my daughter telling me that she took the dogs out one last time. It took about 3 minutes. She took the dogs downstairs, looked up and saw a strange cat at the top of the stairs. But no, this was her little black cat Theda. Around her neck was the collar that her big brother wears. During the 3 minutes Alex was outside, the collar slipped off the neck of one cat and onto the neck of another. Yikes. My first thought was that someone was in the house and switched them. But there's no way a stranger could come into the house undetected by the dogs. Could not happen. Was it a prank? Did my daughter switch the collars, take a picture, and make up a spooky story? No, that just isn't something she would do, and her sister insists that she was genuinely freaked out at the time. Were the cats tussling, and did Theda catch the collar with her claw, pull it off her brother, and then put it on her own head? Could that happen? In 3 minutes? Or was there ghostly intervention? Paranormal or simply abnormal? We don't know, and the cats aren't telling. But you have cats, and you're paranormal investigators. Is there any expert opinion to be had on this strange little event? You're the ones to offer it. We'd be most interested in knowing what you think.
There's so much to love about those stories. Thank you, Marianne. And the first thing is obviously, you'll know this if you listen to the show, we say it all the time, our best stories are from the people that go, I don't believe in ghosts, but...
Yeah, I don't believe in all that nonsense, but... And they come out with a cracking story.
And this was just one of those stories. As to the cat collars, I don't know.
No.
Our cats would never wear collars.
No.
And if they want to get them off, yeah, they will get them off, but they'll get them off about 3 seconds after you put them on.
They'll find a way to get them off, but yeah, you would never catch any of ours putting them on. I know I've had cats before that have tolerated collars, but I can't ever imagine a situation where one would take one off another cat and be able to get them on.
No, I think cats either they're absolutely fine with collars or they can't stand them. So if your cat normally wears a collar, I can't see why it would suddenly take to pulling it off if that's never happened before.
No. And it seems like a weird prank as well.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's just not likely,
I think I'd just be scratching my head. I wouldn't be like, oh, that's a cracking prank that was.
No, unless the cats were pranking you.
Who knows with cats?
Who knows with cats?
Cats and electricity, you never know what they're up to.
No. But the likelihood of one cat managing to get their collar off and then it happening to go onto the head of another... that's so incredibly unlikely. We've never had anything like that happen.
No, getting the collar off, cats are amazing escape artists. They'll get out.
But they won't put anything on
no.
deliberately. No, that is so strange. I don't know what's going on there, but we've had experiences in this house with things just vanishing and then appearing, just seeming to apparate almost in a completely different and very unlikely place. So maybe it's just one of those occasions. They do seem to be very random. We'll get like a slew of them here and then there'll be nothing for months.
Yeah,
nothing will happen.
Strange.
We've had a couple of incidences recently of, it's just happened to me. It hasn't happened to Fitz at all. But things literally just flying off shelves.
Yeah,
in
the
front
last
of
few
me.
days, things have been jumping off shelves in front of Lil all the time. It's
but
really
that's
strange.
never happened before.
No.
Never. I don't know why. So I think you do find when you've got things going on in the house They don't always follow a set pattern. It's not the case of, that never happens in our house. Trust me, anything can happen at any time. I think they like to surprise you sometimes.
Indeed. So I don't think we've got a huge amount to offer you by way of explanation. I knew you mentioned that we're paranormal investigators, and I've just done bunny ears that everybody can see because we're on a podcast.
We wish we could call ourselves that.
Yeah, I mean, we've done, like 2 investigations?
Two
as
or
like
three.
the sort of junior hangers-on that it'd be like, what are you doing? What are you doing there? Why are you doing that?
We aspire to be paranormal investigators.
We aspire to be paranormal investigators, so we don't claim that lofty title.
No.
So
we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I don't sort of take it because we don't have much of an idea that there isn't one.
No.
Somebody
Cats,
else.
however, we're definitely experts in cats.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I can't imagine any.
No, I can't imagine a situation where that would realistically happen, especially not in 3 minutes.
No, just nothing. Sorry, I've got nothing for you.
Got nothing.
I got nothing.
But we really enjoyed the stories, though. Thank you so much.
And that is all the listener stories we have for you this episode. Thank you so much to all of you that shared your experiences. We absolutely love hearing them and, of course, sharing them, which is what the show is all about. We're always looking for more of people's paranormal encounters, so if you've experienced something spooky, then please do get in touch to share your story through our website at notcuntsvs.com, because we really need some more.
We do. The stories, your stories are the backbone of this show, and without it, we wouldn't really have a show. So if you have an experience that you're willing to share, we would absolutely love to hear it.
Now, due to that which shall not be named, we have been stuck in lockdown in Coffee HQ, not able to go out and visit lots of exciting spooky locations to
For
tell you
about
about.
108 years.
Yes, so
That's what it feels like.
it has been a bit claustrophobic. So, we haven't got a paranormal postcard to share with you this episode, so what we've done instead is we've had to think about some of the types of paranormal experiences that we find the most fascinating.
Yes, we've been asked quite a few times recently by you guys what our favourite ghost stories are. And that's a very difficult question to answer because we've heard so many amazing stories and they're all honestly special in their own ways. We could never ever pick a favourite. But that said, we do find that we have some favourite types of ghost stories, particular kinds of phenomenon that we find ourselves irresistibly drawn to. And we're going to start exploring one of those today. One type of paranormal event that I find endlessly fascinating is time slips. And part of that appeal is the mystery of what they are. Where do they even belong in the catalogue of paranormal phenomena? Are they ghosts bleeding through from the past to the present? Or are they psychic flashbacks only playing out in the mind of the witness? Or are they stone tape style playbacks, some past tragic event having left a tangible imprint on the material world that continues to echo down the ages? Or is it a clashing of timelines when the inhabitants of both sides equally are shocked by the presence of one another? Well, the answer would seem to be all of the above. Because when you start looking into the phenomena, far from being able to nail down a time slip archetype, instead you find ever more weird and wonderful variations and rabbit holes to go down. And you all know how much we love a rabbit hole. The other reason they captivate me so is because, really, these are the first paranormal stories I came across in my childhood reading. These were the books that enthralled me. Stories of children suddenly finding their quite ordinary modern-day surroundings melting away to reveal Victorian landscapes, or coming nose to nose with an old house's long-dead 17th century occupant. Books like Moondial, Tom's Midnight Garden, and of course The Children of Greenough lit up my childhood imagination. And with my parents' seemingly endless enthusiasm for visiting historic properties, I spent a lot of time just hoping and wishing that today would be the day I rounded a corner of the latest dusty, creaking-floored stately home and stumbled out of my own time and into another. I peeked around doorways hoping to catch a glimpse of a roaring fire and a bubbling cast-iron pot in one of the gigantic hearths that now lay cold, grey and unlit. I strained my ears listening for the swish and rustle of crinoline down the long, dark corridors, for a footstep or whisper on the stairs. I leaned out of attic windows hoping to see a satin-gowned lady, parasol in hand, taking a stroll around manicured gardens. But it never happened. As I got older, I learned to distinguish historic properties that had a different feeling about them to others. I started to recognise my own particular spidey senses that led me deeper into the world of the paranormal. But I never had that full-on time slip moment I wanted so badly, although I never stopped hoping. Of course, like anything in life, real experiences often aren't as dramatic as books and films make us hope for. But as an adult, I think I may, after all, have had a couple of experiences myself that could fall into the potential time slip category. The first is one I've talked about on the show before, and happened at the really quite haunted house where Fitz and I first lived together. It was a simple encounter. I would go so far as to say that it felt so normal it took me a while to realise anything of note had happened at all. I was just sitting in our bedroom, facing the door, when a young chap half walked in, poking his head and torso around the door deliberately and with speed, and looking straight into the room as he did so. In that first instant, I wasn't even surprised. It was a shared house, and housemates often popped up to our third-floor bedroom to say hello. But in the second instant, I realised that, having had time to process the man's face, I found I didn't recognise him. And in the next beat, I saw that he didn't recognise me either. We stood opposite each other for probably only a second, each registering the surprise and confusion on each other's faces. It was clear in that tiny, brief moment that neither one of us had seen what we'd been expecting to, or understood who we were looking at. And then, he was simply gone. There was no one there. No one behind the door, no one on the landing, no one on the stairs. And after the fact, it dawned on me that I hadn't heard anybody coming up the stairs or across the landing either. And as it turned out, nobody had any guests visiting the house that day. Paranormal sightings were not uncommon in this house, and in fact this was one of the more pleasant ones and one which I didn't find disturbing at all. But I was fascinated by the fact that this ghost had seen me, had locked eyes with me, and had been very surprised to find me in that room. I don't know who he was popping in to see, but it certainly wasn't me. And I was left with the very strange sensation that, on this occasion, I was the ghost. And the first time slip story I want to share with you today is almost a combination of my long wished for hope of stumbling across a scene from another time and of the witness taking the role of the ghost. And I'll start off by saying that this is the kind of story I would often not include in the show due to lack of research. I normally like to have multiple sources for my research so I can cross-reference, but this story seems to have never been published in a book or newspaper, and possibly due to the witness's wish to remain anonymous. So the account can only be tracked down on the internet, and of course this could raise questions to its authenticity. But as with any paranormal sighting, most of the time all we have is the word of the witness. And so, until I'm given any good reason to doubt that word, I'll take their story at face value. After all, I hope that every single person I share my paranormal encounters with will offer me the same courtesy. And really, this is just too good a time-slip tale not to share. The story emerged via the witness's niece, who recounted a strange experience her aunt had told her about from her childhood in post-war London. The witness's real names are unknown as the aunt wanted to retain anonymity, but in the retellings of the experience, the two witnesses are usually referred to by the names Beryl and Daisy. Beryl was 7 years old when she returned to London in 1947. having spent most of the war as an evacuee outside of London. Peacetime may have been upon the city, but the streets were punctuated by bomb damage, half-collapsed buildings, bomb craters, sites strewn with rubble and wreckage. And as bizarre and worrying as it may sound to our modern-day ears, these bomb sites were the playgrounds for post-war children across the country, and Beryl and Daisy were no different. Beryl told her niece how they would search through the rubble for hidden treasure, and how she could remember the semi-derelict buildings, some of which were only standing due to being propped up on wooden frames, and others had been half ripped open so that the top floor was left a gaping maw with sharp glass shard teeth. The children were aware that these were unsafe places to play, and Beryl's older sister Daisy was frequently warning her to not wander off into the more dangerous areas, to pay attention to where she was going, lest she fall into a bomb crater. But that day, when they were exploring a boarded-up street called Close Square, they came upon a tall house with an overgrown garden. And Daisy left Beryl behind while she went to explore an outhouse, telling her younger sister to stay where she was. Beryl recalled that as she was waiting for her older sister to return, she found the atmosphere of the garden strange, and she was fascinated by the tall house, which had a gap in the wall that she described as being like a giant mouse hole. Of course, houses with bits of wall missing were not uncommon at the time, but something about this particular house caught the little girl's attention, and, risking the wrath of her older sister, she snuck towards the hole in the wall for a closer look. Being only small, she was able to squeeze halfway through the gap in the cobwebby loose bricks, but what she saw was not the derelict empty building she was expecting. Her eyes were drawn to a large open fireplace. A roaring fire was licking away in the hearth at the bottom of a large pot, which was being attended to by a woman wearing a white linen cap and an old-fashioned outfit. Beryl described the room as looking like a scene straight out of the film she used to watch at the pictures. She remembers striped wall coverings, chairs with spindly legs, and old-fashioned looking furniture. As she watched, more people appeared, seemingly from nowhere. A woman in grey clothes and a bonnet, a man wearing a green coat with a ribbed front, and a tall military Shako-style cap on his head, and last, a young boy in a blue robe. Up to this point, she'd gone unnoticed by the people in the room. She was busy simply wondering why there were people in this boarded-up empty building. And at some point, she wondered why it was so cold, and why the fire didn't seem to be giving off any heat. But just then, she was discovered. The young boy caught sight of her and visibly waved and yelled at the girl, but Beryl could hear no sound. The other occupants of the room didn't respond to either Beryl's presence or the boy's surprise, and Beryl quickly retreated before she was discovered. She caught up with her older sister Daisy and wanted to know how come there are people in this empty house on a boarded-up street. Her sister was incredulous, probably thinking she had an overactive imagination, but she allowed Beryl to bring her to the hole in the wall of the house all the same, if only to dispel her little sister's imaginings. Crawling into the gap, Daisy was satisfied that there was nothing strange to be found after all, and turned back to her sister. "What people? There's only dust and rubble." Not knowing what to make of this remark, Beryl swiftly followed suit, but found her sister was not messing around after all. Where only moments before there had been a fire, furniture, a family, there was now only damp, cold, an empty room littered with loose bricks, bits of wood, and odd lumps of coal. But even more strangeness was to come. In the following days, the girls returned to the same house, hoping to find some clue to the mystery. but the hole in the wall was gone. There was no sign that it had been bricked up. There was no sign that there had ever been a hole at all, and the house remained boarded up and empty. Beryl maintains to this day that what she saw was not any kind of imagining or hallucination. Her niece, having looked into her aunt's description of the clothing worn by the people of the house, determined that she may have been describing a soldier's uniform for the Napoleonic War. But who these people were and just what Beryl saw that day will likely forever remain a mystery. I do hope, however, that the aunt or her niece will come forward one day and allow the experience to be published more widely, because it's a truly fascinating encounter.
Yeah, that was a good find. It's a really interesting story.
It is. It's just a shame that there literally is only one source for this information. It's somebody's published it in a blog. We'll put the links in the show notes as always. But yeah, it was just a conversation that happened on a message board between the niece and an interested party, and it's been written up in a blog post. And we came across it, I think, on a YouTube video to start with. And I couldn't trace it any further back than that. There was no further back.
If it's somebody telling their own personal experience, you're probably not going to find much else.
No, exactly. And this is the trouble. You know, I'm very much into my research. I like to cross-reference. I like multiple sources.
Oh, very much so.
I'm very meticulous about it. But
if you wonder why we only do one episode a month, it's because of the research and the effort that goes into check it. Like, if we tell you something, we've generally, you can't necessarily rely that we're 100% accurate, but we've done our best to make sure that we're not just, I read it on a blog, so it's true.
No, we always look for multiples. We try and go back as far as possible to the original source if we can. And actually, that's going to come up in the episode multiple times because it was just one of those episodes. But I really don't think that we can discount something just off the fact that we can't cross-reference it.
No.
Because, all of our stories, our listener stories, our own personal stories, you can't cross-reference those.
No, they're first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
So what else can you say?
And that's where every single ghost story that we ever know has come from. It's come from a first-hand account somewhere. It's just a shame that there's no sort of witness interview, as it were, here.
Yeah.
That would be perfect.
This story, considering what the story is about, the weirdest thing for me is the fact that there was no evidence of a hole being there or having been patched up.
Yeah, that's very strange.
It's almost like, seeing the ghost in the house, that's fine, that's commonplace, I don't find that strange at all. But repairing a wall with no sign of making a repair, how intriguing.
Yeah, no, that you're right though. It does add it just adds another layer of mystery to it, doesn't it?
And unless the wall had literally been completely replaced, but she seems to imply that it was, clearly there was cobwebs and it was something that had been like that for a while.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that got me about this story, especially, was the fact that it was the kid, the little boy, saw Beryl. The adults didn't notice him at all.
But was it because they didn't look or because they couldn't see her?
I don't know, but it's this meeting of different times again, this clashing of timelines. In this story, Beryl was the ghost. I feel like she was the ghost of the little boy. The little boy had been spooked by this face that had appeared out of his wall.
Well, you've got to wonder. We have sort of ghosts that can interact with you and ghosts that don't seem to know whether you're there. Is this a case where there's two? Where she's seeing a replay of the Napoleonic era, blah-de-blah, woman stoking the fireman in uniform, and the boy is another ghost, but that is an intelligent one.
Oh my goodness, you've just melted my brain. Let's save those questions, because we've got a lot more to get through yet.
But if anybody knows more about this case, then do let us know, even if it's to debunk it. Of course, we'd be disappointed, but we would rather know.
We would.
Because, to be honest, we just can't really think of anywhere else to look.
No, we've sort of exhausted all avenues at this point.
Indeed. But from a sparsely documented time slip to a far more widely known one, or ones. And whilst we may think of the quintessential time slip as transporting us back to the Victorians and beyond, this seems to be of a much more modern nature. Now, something that seems to be a common theme amongst time slip stories is that they seem to happen to a person or small group of people in a random location, and even if the people affected attempt to retrace their steps, they're unable to have a similar experience. Be it strange atmospheric conditions, luck, or something else beyond our understanding, there seems to be little we can do to monitor or investigate them. However, there is one place that seems to have an unusually lax relation to the arrow of time. In the city of Liverpool, not too far from the docks and in the heart of an area called the Rope Walks, lies Bold Street. And Bold Street, rather like a daydreaming teenager, just can't seem to keep its mind on the present. I remember that fairly recently, Lil and I were watching a paranormal program, as we frequently do, and there was a story of a time slip on Bold Street. Chasing down the story for this episode, I ended up falling down a bit of a rabbit hole, which we also seem to frequently do. The story, as I remembered it, was that a local ne'er-do-well had been spotted shoplifting from a shop close to Bold Street. Making off on foot and being chased by a security guard, the petty criminal slipped down an alley expecting to be shortly followed by the man chasing him. Running out of steam and finding himself in a quiet dead-end alley, he was resigning himself to capture when the man following him failed to materialize. He cautiously stepped back into the main street and found it strangely different when he'd left it only moments ago. The road looked different, and the cars driving past were all what we would now call classic or historical. The people too were dressed straight out of the 60s, and our shoplifting friend began to realise that something extraordinary had occurred. Seeing a newspaper nearby, he was able to confirm that he was indeed, somehow, still in the same place, but in the 1960s. Now in a state of panic, he forged on, praying to find something familiar, when all of a sudden he found himself inexplicably back in the present. I found this story easily enough, and whilst there are a few more details to the story than I recounted here, it's been covered more than a few times in other places, most specifically in Tom Slemon's Haunted Liverpool series of books, and so I'd recommend that you check them out if you'd like to know more. There was one more thing though. On investigating the story, Tom was able to speak to the security guard that was chasing the young shoplifter. He was able to confirm that he did indeed follow the man into the dead-end street, but he vanished into thin air before him. Fascinating stuff, and I was to find that this story was far from the only one in the Bold Street area, and wasn't even the most famous one. Tom Slemon has recorded quite a few accounts from the area, but perhaps more impressively, Parascience, an organisation dedicated to the scientific investigation of the paranormal, have stated that they've received around 100 reports of time slips in the area. The most famous time slip story from Bold Street involves an off-duty policeman called Frank, who was shopping with his wife Carol, when they split up to purchase different items and agreed to meet back at a bookshop on Bold Street. When Frank went to meet his wife at the bookshop, he found Bold Street oddly quiet, and was surprised when an old van nearly ran him over and honked its horn at him as he passed. He was further surprised to find that the bookshop bore a different name and seemed to be selling women's clothing, and only then did he notice that all the people around him were wearing clothing that appeared to be from the 40s or 50s. That is, other than a young lady who was wearing clearly modern clothes and carrying a shopping bag from a more modern shop. They both entered the shop, but as they did so, it changed back to the bookshop that Frank had expected, and was likewise filled with modern customers. The lady that had entered with him exclaimed in surprise that it was a bookshop. She believed that it had been a new clothes shop and quickly left. I very much summed up the story to its salient parts, as during my research I found that whilst most versions are quite specific in various details, oddly so in some cases, that these details are often different in each version of the story. If we take the van that honked at Frank as an example, in one version the van bore the livery of Cardin's, which was indeed a Liverpool firm that had a fleet of vans in the 50s, but in others it was in the livery of Kaplin's or Kaplan's. There was a firm nearby owned by a Louis Kaplan at the time that might also have been expected to have liveried vans, and the Kaplin's variant might simply be a misremembrance of the Kaplan name. But Cardin and Kaplan are not exactly common names, and to have both crop up as verifiable facts makes me wonder if perhaps people had looked for details after the fact that might make the story more compelling. Being unable to confirm which, if any, was the original story makes me wonder if it was perhaps a more simple experience that's become embellished over time. I even wonder if it might be an amalgamation of the seemingly bountiful collection of accounts of timeslips on Bold Street. It certainly appears to have inspired others to recount their own experiences, many of whom previously assumed that they'd wandered into a period drama set, such as the lady arriving at the central station leading onto Bold Street, that found herself on a cobbled street populated with horse-drawn carriages, and a man who came across a group of men in Edwardian clothing that he assumed at the time were part of a historical tour group. Many of the accounts have very similar elements too. Multiple witnesses have reported that it suddenly became very dim or very quiet, or both, and almost all of the reports indicate that the witnesses were able to both see and interact with other people during the experience. The sheer number of reports would seem to imply that there's definitely something strange going on in Bold Street, and I hope that we get the chance to investigate it for ourselves. Before we move on though, there was one more story that really jumped out at me. During the 1960s, a man was descending the stairs at Central Station off of Bold Street in order to catch a train. As he did so, he happened to catch sight of his grandmother heading towards the exit of the station. This might not be considered unusual until you learned that his grandmother had passed away a few years before. He was sure that it was her, especially as she dressed in her own unique style, and so he rushed frantically across the station to find her. She turned a corner as he was close behind her, but when he stepped around it, she was nowhere to be seen, and there was nowhere that she might have been able to reach in that time so as to be out of view. One can only wonder what might have happened should he have been able to catch up to her before she disappeared, to have one last chance to speak to a loved one that had passed on.
As Fitz mentioned, we couldn't hope to cover all the Bold Street time slips in this episode. I mean, there have literally been entire books written about them. There are so many. And like you said, Fitz, I do feel like maybe some of these reports and details within the accounts have become jumbled just because of the sheer volume of them. And because there are common themes and common elements that, you know, if you've read a few of these stories in a row and then you just sort of rewrite them in another place, you could easily just mash them up a little bit, get them muddled together. And we find that so often in these stories, and we're just about to find some more. In fact, this is definitely turned into the episode of Rabbit Holes. And the next story I want to share with you sent me down a fair few of them as well. This is an especially odd one because instead of getting a glimpse of the past, the witness seems to have got a glimpse of the future. We're heading back to post-war Britain again, but post-World War I this time, in the years between the First and Second World Wars, when the Royal Air Force was still in its infancy and unaware of the role they were about to take up, when the unthinkable happened and the country found itself at war once again. It was 1935, and monoplanes like the rugged Hawker Hurricane and the sleek Supermarine Spitfire were yet to take their place as the mainstay of the RAF. The tried and tested biplane was still the main order of the day, and one such aircraft, the polished aluminium biplane with a Rolls-Royce V12 engine, was being taken on a jaunt to Scotland by one Victor Goddard. Wing Commander Goddard was planning on playing golf at Gillane, a village near the banks of the estuary on the east coast of Scotland, known as the Firth of Forth. These were obviously very different times when one could hop in a service biplane and just pop off a couple of 100 miles across the country for a game of golf with the lads. And that's just what Victor Goddard did, taking his Hawker Hart and flying north. He knew that there was an old airfield not far from the golf club, just the next town over in fact, near a village called Drem. This would have been a very convenient place to make his landing, but he wasn't sure it was in a good enough condition to land on and he didn't want to risk it. So instead, he headed for an airfield near Edinburgh, and from there drove the remaining 30 miles to the golf club. While he was in the area though, he thought he might as well check out the airfield near Drem for future excursions. It would be pretty handy if his trip didn't need to include the extra drive. But when he arrived, he quickly saw that it was in no fit state to receive planes. The airfield had fallen into disuse after World War I and had reverted to farmland. The hangars were nearing dereliction and were being pushed into service to house hay and farm machinery. The land where the airstrip once was had been divided up as pasture for sheep and cattle. It was clear that this was not going to be a good future landing site, and with that, he put it out of his mind and got on with his journey. So it wasn't until his return flight that he was to think again of Drem Airfield. And this time, it was not a planned visit. During his southwards return journey the next day, he encountered a terrible storm that knocked him completely off course, the low black cloud and driving rain making conditions so dangerous that he feared for his safety. Somehow, he ended up near Drem Airfield, and he headed towards the familiar hangars, not with the intention of landing there, but to reorient himself. As he approached, he recognised the airfield with certainty, partly because he'd surveyed the airfield only the very day before, so it was still very fresh in his mind, but also because he was flying at less than 30 feet to escape the low cloud, so he got a pretty up-close and personal look at the place. But just as he came up on the gloomy, rain-sodden hangars, a very peculiar thing happened. It was as if he burst out of the storm and into a clear, sunny day. Brilliant sunlight suddenly lit the scene, showing an airfield that was clear and newly mown. The tarmac was fresh and new, the hangars refurbished, and far from the tumble-down ruins crammed with farm equipment that he'd seen yesterday, now they housed planes. As he watched, two blue-overalled mechanics pushed a monoplane he didn't recognise out of one of the hangar doors. As he buzzed overhead, he saw other aircraft parked on the tarmac, his trained eye quickly recognising 3 Avro 504 biplanes and another monoplane he didn't recognise. He couldn't fail to notice that all 5 planes were painted bright yellow. As he sped across the airfield and pulled up to clear the height of the hangars, he suddenly found himself plunging back into the storm clouds and pouring rain, and the strange scene vanished. Once safely landed later that day, he had all kinds of questions about what he'd seen. It was totally impossible that the airfield could have been restored from its derelict state in less than a day, and there had certainly been no aircraft there when he'd visited. What had happened to the farm and grazing animals that had been there yesterday? He was extremely perplexed by the 2 unrecognisable monoplanes that he saw on the tarmac. Monoplanes were not commonly in use at this time, and this was a man that knew his planes. And why were they all painted yellow? There were other details too. For example, the blue overalls the mechanics were wearing weren't standard uniform. Normally, they'd be a brown colour. But maybe the biggest question he had of all was why none of the men outside the hangars had looked up when he'd buzzed them at less than 30 feet. This was the thing that really burrowed into his brain and wouldn't let go. In his account, he says, "No airman anywhere, on any tarmac in the world, could then have failed to look at me had I been there for him to see, and my roaring hawker had been there for him to hear. Those airmen did not pay the slightest heed to me or it." And for anyone who's ever been to an air show, especially a vintage air show, you'll know that it's simply not possible to ignore an aircraft like that whizzing past, let alone at that low of an altitude. But all of these questions were to remain unanswered until 4 years later, in 1939, when the Second World War broke out and the airfield at Drem was reopened as a flying school. The airfield was retarmacked. The hangars were restored, all of which must have piqued Goddard's curiosity, of course. But what was even more astonishing to him was learning which planes were housed at the newly reopened airfield, because it turned out to be the Avro 504s, the very planes he'd spotted on the tarmac in 1935. And even more uncannily, these Avro 504s were painted bright yellow. It happened that around this time, the RAF started to paint their training planes yellow for better visibility, whereas back in 1935, Goddard was used to seeing the silver chrome biplanes that were typical of the day. Also based at the airfield was a new type of monoplane called a Magister. He describes in his own words the similarities between this new incarnation of Drem and what he'd witnessed 4 years previously. He says, "The Magister was new. It was a trainer monoplane. It was the spitting image of the monoplanes I saw that stormy day 4 years before at Drem. None of that type existed back in 1935, not in our normal consciousness. Meanwhile, our airmen's dungarees had also been transformed. No longer were they brown, but blue." He realised at that point that the strange, sunlit scene he witnessed in the middle of that storm in 1935 must have been a glimpse into how the airfield was going to look 4 years in the future. This experience is one he stood by for the rest of his life, and indeed he published it in his own books and in a well-known flying journal. He was a ranking officer who'd studied at Cambridge and had an impressive service record. This was a man who knew flying, he knew his planes, and who no one really had any reason to doubt as far as we know. And it's perhaps because of all of that that Goddard's Timeslip story is one of the most retold Timeslip stories out there. This does mean, however, as we've so often found with widely circulated witness accounts, that in some of the retellings the details of the event vary quite widely. It's commonly the case with well-known paranormal phenomena that each writer who retells the story puts their own slight embellishment on it, and then someone else retells that version of it, and so on, until you find that there are details in the best-known versions taken as gospel that never even appeared in the original. We always try where possible to go as far back as we can to find the version reported in the witness's own words, but unfortunately it's not always possible, or practical at least. So Goddard did recount this tale in his book Flight Towards Reality, but sadly there doesn't seem to be any electronic versions of this title. It's out of print, and second-hand copies are going for anywhere between £100 and £300, which is definitely outside of our budget and a bit ridiculous, to be honest. We did, however, study a version that was published in a book called Modern Mysticism by Michael Gillert, and is claimed to be quoted from Flight Towards Reality, and certainly it does appear to be written in Goddard's own words, and that's as close to the truth as we can get for now. But we've found some details in retold versions that didn't appear anywhere in this account, such as strangely coloured yellow clouds that accompanied the storm, I don't know if these appeared in any of Goddard's witness statements or whether they're a byproduct of time and multiple authors, but if anyone does have any more light to shed, I'd love to know. We also ended up getting in a bit of a tangle of research over this story, largely because the name Goddard, or I should say Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard, as he would become titled later in life, would become rather synonymous over the years with strange and paranormal happenings. One of which was becoming the centre of a premonition story that ended up inspiring a movie.
The movie is called The Night My Number Came Up, and the plot appears to follow Goddard's account of the incident fairly accurately. From what I've been able to gather, Goddard, based in Singapore at the time, was attending a cocktail party in his honour when he overheard one of the party's guests say how sad it was that Goddard had passed away in a plane crash the day before. Somewhat surprised to hear that he'd perished the day before, Goddard interrupted the man with a cheery, "I'm not quite dead yet," and went on to query what had given the man that impression. Visibly shocked by the appearance of Goddard, the man went on to describe a vivid dream in which the man had seen Goddard crash his plane. When pressed, he went on to describe the type of aircraft, the passengers, the weather, and the area in which the plane had crashed. Goddard took it all in his stride. The plane was not the type he was due to fly, and the description included civilian passengers when he was due to be flying purely military personnel. However, as the flight approached, the aircraft he was due to fly was replaced by the model specified in the dream, and he discovered that there would indeed be civilians on the flight, 2 men and a woman, as had also been described by the man at the party. Somewhat shaken, Goddard embarked on the flight and did encounter stormy weather in an area that also matched the description the party guest had provided, and due to various factors, they were forced to carry out an emergency landing, or in effect to crash. Fortunately, unlike the dream, everyone on board was to survive. Again, I very much summarised the experience, as I was unable to find the original account of the story from Goddard himself, and I had a few niggling doubts over its authenticity. The original story was said to have been published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1951. As I mentioned, I wasn't able to find the exact edition containing the original account, but the information I could find seemed to imply that they published fictional stories. Another later publication of the story was in the Reader's Digest Junior Omnibus, which likewise appears to publish fictional stories. The other accounts I found had notable differences. The person sharing his dream was either an English soldier or a Navy officer, and the plane type varied in some, but only the specific aircraft in others. In some, Goddard was the pilot, and in others merely a passenger. Of course, it's entirely possible that the accounts are based on a real event, and the various retellings have embellished or altered the events. That, or did Goddard intentionally change some of the details of his account? In fact, I did turn up a reference to the story, where Goddard was to write to the man after the crash, but before the story was published. He provided the story for the man to review, though noted that he changed his identity for publication out of courtesy. It said that the man replied to confirm that he experienced a dream in which he was sure Goddard had died, but was unable to remember providing any of the further detail that Goddard had ascribed to him. They were, though, both adamant that something paranormal had occurred.
See what we mean about the rabbit holes? We love a good rabbit hole, but sometimes you end up getting stuck in them.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't even the most famous of Goddard's paranormal encounters. Now, if you're a bit of a paranormal nerd like me, you will most likely have seen, at one time or another, a very famous ghost photograph. It's an old black and white shot of a large group of military men and women, standing in neat rows and all looking very spick and span in their uniforms and hats. One member of the group is a little conspicuous. On the back row, almost obscured by a chap in front, one member of the party is not wearing his uniform hat, and hasn't the same expression of seriousness about him as the others. Rather, he seems to be peeking out from the back row mischievously, and you might think that he was just messing around for a lark, a very early version of photobombing perhaps, were it not for the fact that he had died just a few days earlier. This is such a well-known ghost photograph that I'd be surprised if any of you haven't seen it, but I wonder how many of you know that the photo is called Goddard's Squadron, because I definitely didn't. And yep, that's the very same Victor Goddard who would later in life experience the strange forward timeslip, although this photo was taken in 1918, well before his timeslip experience. Oddly enough, just as we started work on this timeslip episode, I came across an old Australian paranormal documentary from the 90s in my YouTube recommendations. It was called The Ghost Files, and one of the stories covered was this photograph. And I was fascinated, mentally noting it down for another time, maybe another episode. And it was only later, when I really started digging into the research on Goddard's timeslip, that this photo kept coming up in relation to his name, and then I realised the connection. The Ghost Files documentary included an interview with Bobby Capel, who was actually part of the group in the picture and knew the man who'd made a ghostly appearance on film. Bobby was Wren, part of the Women's Royal Naval Service, on Cranwell Air Base, Lincolnshire at the time the photo was taken. And in the documentary, she describes her memories from the day they all received their copy of the photo. She said there was a collective gasp of surprise when they spotted the extra face in the back row. And all of them unmistakably recognised the face as that of a mechanic called Freddie Jackson, part of a group of friends in the transport yard at Cranwell who had sadly died only days before. She went on to say that he would have undoubtedly been in the group photo had he not died, and that they all found it very eerie to see him so clearly in the photograph when they knew he was dead when it was taken. Although this photograph has never been disproven, there are many who have wondered if it was faked, or if it was simply another person popping in and out of shot during the necessarily long photo exposures of the time, and of course that is one possibility. But the fact remains that the deceased Freddie Jackson's colleagues were able to instantly and assuredly identify his face in the photo. And surely they would have recognised it if it was another of their close-knit group. On the potential for fakery in a 1996 article in Navy News magazine, Bobby had this to say: "I cannot entertain the idea that this was a deliberate fake. For one thing, the photographer came from outside the base. He didn't know any of us, and once he'd taken his picture, he left immediately. He just would not have known about the accident. I've thought and puzzled over it for years, but I can think of no explanation other than it is the picture of a ghost. When we lined up for that photograph, we all knew that one familiar face would not be with us. Only later did we actually discover that he was." Goddard himself was similarly sure that no trickery had been involved, and in his book Flight Towards Reality, he had this to say about the picture and about the photographers, Bassano's. "There he was, and no mistake, although a little fainter than the rest. Indeed, he looked as though he was not altogether there, not really with that group, for he alone was capless, smiling. All the rest was serious and set and wearing service caps." Goddard went on to state that he was certain there was no, as he put it, hanky-panky in the dark room. His quote continues, "Not only would Bassano's not dare to fake it, the negative was scrutinised for faking and was found to be untouched." Again, this is a paranormal event that's been retold so many times that it's really difficult to pick up the strands of the original story at this point. A lot of accounts state that the photo was actually taken in 1919, But as far as we could find, both Bobby Capel and Goddard himself seem to have put the date of the photo at around the time of Armistice Day, November 1918. Now, the reason we went down the rabbit hole on this one was because we spent a lot of time trying to see if the reports added up, much like the Liverpool Bold Street timeslips. There's a lot of confusing information about this case. Most reports refer to this photo simply as the Goddard Squadron photo, and a quick search for Goddard Squadron has the unit based at HMS Deadlifts. HMS Deadlifts is a Royal Naval air station near Portsmouth in the south of England, whereas Bobby Capel relayed in her retelling that the transport yard the squadron was based at was RAF Cranwell in Lincolnshire, the two bases being over 200 miles from each other. And there's also some confusion over whether it was in fact an RAF base or a naval base. Well, we did look into all of this as much as we could, so Fitz.
It was a bit of a headache to unravel it all, because obviously at this point in the First World War and then moving into the Second World War, they were changing from the Royal Flying Corps to the Royal Air Force, which amalgamated the Royal Naval Air Service. So it was all kind of a mishmash, and you actually notice in the photograph itself that there are people wearing naval uniforms, there are people wearing army uniforms, there are people wearing the new RAF uniforms. So there's a massive time of change, and everything is mixed and mishmashed. And Cranwell used to be a Royal Naval Air Service training centre, which, when it was repurposed into the RAF, the name of this was reused at other bases, and it's been various places since then. And it was HMS Deadlifts. So Cranwell and Deadlifts were the same location.
And it was both an RAF and a naval base.
And it doesn't surprise me that if you've been working at somewhere for, I don't know how many years or however long you've been working, you've known it at one name and all of a sudden it gets changed to another name.
You're not suddenly going to change how you refer to it though, are you?
No, there's so many places around here that might be so-and-so street and you'll remember it as, the Jitty.
Yeah.
Because it's just the way you've always known it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a lot of the things here. They may have called it another name because that's what it was when they started there.
Yeah, and of course, when, they refer into HMS Deadlifts, it makes it sound like a ship, which is really confusing because they're saying, well, why were there aircraft mechanics on a ship called HMS Deadlifts and there's 200 miles between them, and it does sound ridiculous. But when you actually pick it apart and realise that they were both. They were literally, it was literally Navy and Air Force and not a ship and an RAF base. It was, it's so confusing.
Yeah, and even today, the Navy have land bases. I was at HMS Dryad many moons ago when I was a young RAF cadet.
Whippersnapper.
See, the beauty of the RAF cadets was we were allowed to go on the Army and Navy cadet outings and they weren't allowed to go on ours.
So that's a bit rude.
We could go flying and do gliding and take trips in transport planes, and then I could go on a naval warfare course as well, which was fun, where I learnt about SSN missiles and Scuds and firing phalanx and gatekeeper guns.
All right, nerd, rein it in.
Which was fantastic fun. But HMS Dryad was a land-based naval base.
Not a ship.
So I must admit, it didn't twig for me that anybody might think that it couldn't be a land base, because obviously I'd been to one as a child, so I always knew that they had them.
Yeah, but as a complete civvy, to me, if you say HMS anything, I think it's a ship.
I can see why you'd assume. Yeah.
I can definitely see why people got confused. One of the other things that a lot of people have brought up is that people who started researching this and tried to find death certificates, death records of this Frederick Jackson, haven't been able to find anything that fits the period. I think part of the problem of that is we're not completely sure what the period was and exactly when he died. But also what we've found is that back in those days, people very often went by something other than their first name. You'll find that in families, you'll have generations of men and women that are named after their fathers and their fathers' fathers. So you'll have in a family people that have an official name that's on their birth certificate, and then they go by a completely different name, and often it was a middle name. We've got cases of that in our own families. I've worked with people of older generations where I've worked with them for 5 years and then realised that the name I've been calling them for 5 years isn't actually the name on their birth certificate and driving licence, because it was just such a common thing to do.
So I thought I would try and see if I could find, because like war deaths are generally fairly well recorded and reasonably easy to find. So I started searching, and I found a couple of people with a similar name, but it was in the wrong place, or the wrong date, or the wrong manner of death, or the wrong service, and blah, 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 blah. But going on the information that we had, that the photo was taken around Armistice Day, which was the 11th of November, and that it was based near Cranwell and not where Deadlifts was then at the time, so we were looking in Lincolnshire. I found a war grave record for a George Frederick Jackson, who was buried in Lincolnshire and who died on the 7th of November 1918,
which would have been
4 days before.
Yep.
And it was he was listed as having been an aircraft mechanic and having passed away at an RAF experimental station, or being based at an RAF experimental station.
Based at RAF experimental station, which did throw us a bit. But again, we're back to this thing of, at the time, at that specific base as well. The reason this group photograph was taken was because the squadron was being disbanded.
Yeah.
They were changing from, I think, a naval base to an RAF base. This squadron was going to be no more. That was the whole reason for the photograph. Everything was in flux. Everything was in the middle of turning on its head and becoming something completely different.
Yeah. It may well have been like so on the line that somebody was just like,
didn't know what the name was going to be.
Where did it happen? Well, it's just not as simple as that. It was this. It's probably going to be this. But, you know, they may not have even made the sort of 100% decision or changed the signage or something. Yep. And somebody just went, stuff it, RAF experimental, let's just get the paperwork filled out. So I'm not saying that this is definitely him.
We don't know, but it would fit.
It's an incredibly good coincidence.
And it just goes to prove the point that you can't, you know, things like people not going by their first name have to be taken into account. It's completely within the realms of possibility, and it was very common to go by your middle name rather than your first name. Well, if any of you have any other information about this case, because a lot of you are very much paranormal enthusiasts, you may have looked into this case before, and you may have your own theories about who this Freddie Jackson was and what really happened. Please let us know, because it is a fascinating case, and you can turn into an internet sleuth for hours trying to track down the real version of events and the truth behind this story. And if you don't know about the photograph I'm talking about, do look it up. It is worth a look. It's a very interesting photograph. And as I say, as far as I'm aware, it is yet to be debunked by anybody. And it has been, like the negative has been assessed and looked at. And it was found to be not tampered with. If you just Google Goddard Squadron photo or Goddard Squadron ghost photo, you will find it. And you'll probably recognise it actually when you look it up.
It is something that's very well known in the paranormal community. So yeah you'll probably recognise it. And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for this episode. Thank you to everyone that shared their story this episode, and don't forget that if you've got a story to share, please do get in touch through our website at knockonceforoyes.com. We are always in need of your true paranormal experiences, as they are the heart of the show. There you can also find links to all of our social media, so please do join us on those and take a peek at some of the places we've been and have a chat. Thank you again to our patrons, whose support is vital for us to be able to keep producing the show. And if you'd like to help support the show, please do consider becoming our patron, which you can do by following the links on our website or by visiting patreon.com/KOFY. It's also incredibly helpful if you can leave us a review, recommend us to a friend, and share the show on social media. Not Once VS is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio. And if you have a podcast and you'd like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Not Once VS or narrativeaudio.com. We hope that you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Not Once for Yes.
EVP session end.